1st, 2023, off the coast of Malaysia, the Aframax tanker Pablo, a vessel capable of carrying 700,000 barrels of crude oil, rips apart in a massive explosion. Fire erupts from the deck. Metal shears off like paper. The hull is gutted. Black smoke pours into the sky. Miraculously, the ship was empty of cargo at the time. No oil spill, no environmental catastrophe, just twisted metal and burning wreckage. But in the aftermath, Malaysian authorities face a nightmare scenario. They need to remove the wreck. It's a navigation hazard, a ticking environmental bomb, so they start making calls, looking for the owner, looking for someone to pay for the cleanup, and they find nothing. No clear owner to call, no registered office to sue, no insurance company to file a claim against. The Pablo is a ghost, a zombie ship, operating completely outside the established rules of global maritime trade. Most people looking at the burning wreckage see a maritime accident, a tragic but isolated event. But here's what they miss. This wasn't just a ship breaking down. This was a symptom of a silent economic war, a war fought not with missiles or aircraft carriers, not with sanctions you can see on the evening news, but with actuarial tables, liability clauses, reinsurance contracts, the paperwork that makes global trade possible. Because the question isn't whether ships can float. The question is whether they're allowed to exist financially. And today, we're looking at the most powerful invisible weapon in modern geopolitical conflict. The weaponization of maritime insurance. How do you blockade a country without a navy? That's not a theoretical question. That's the actual strategic problem that Western governments faced in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. They wanted to cut off Russia's oil revenue, starve the war machine. But they couldn't just ban Russian oil entirely. That would send global energy prices into the stratosphere, cause inflation, economic chaos, political suicide. They needed something more surgical, more precise. A valve they could control, and they found it in the most boring, bureaucratic corner of global finance, maritime insurance, specifically something called protection and indemnity insurance, P&I for short. To understand how this weapon works, you have to look past the physical ships, past the tankers and the cargo and the ports. You have to look at the paperwork that keeps them afloat. Because in the global logistics network, there's a concept known as the ticket to trade. A commercial vessel cannot enter a major port, cannot pass through the Suez Canal, cannot dock at a terminal, cannot legally operate without valid P&I insurance. This isn't like your car insurance. This is coverage for oil spills running into billions of dollars, wreck removal, environmental damage, third-party collisions, the kind of liabilities that can bankrupt a shipping company overnight. And here's the critical data point. Approximately 90% of the world's ocean-going tonnage is insured by a small group of mutual associations called the International Group of P&I Clubs. 13 clubs, based primarily in London, with key hubs in Scandinavia and Japan. They're Western entities, bound by Western laws, subject to Western sanctions. Think about what that means for a second. It means that 90% of global trade relies on a financial architecture controlled by the G7 nations. If you cut off access to this insurance, you don't need a navy to blockade a country's exports. You don't need warships patrolling the coast. You simply make their ships uninsurable. You make them radioactive to the global economy. You make them unable to trade. This is the mechanism of the invisible blockade. The P&I clubs weren't designed to be weapons. They were created in the 1800s by ship owners who realized they had a problem. Traditional marine insurance companies would cover the hull of a ship, the physical structure, but they wouldn't cover the open-ended liabilities. What happens if your ship hits another ship? What if your crew member gets injured? What if you spill oil and destroy a coastline? Well, the potential costs were unlimited. Insurance companies wouldn't touch it. So ship owners did something brilliant. They pooled their risk, created mutual associations. Each ship owner would pay into a collective fund. If someone had a claim, the fund would cover it. If there was money left over at the end of the year, everyone's contribution would go down. If there was a major incident, everyone would pay more. It worked. By the early 1900s, these clubs dominated maritime insurance, and they developed a unique structure. They didn't compete on price. They collaborated, shared information, created standards. Most importantly, they created a pooling agreement. For claims above a certain threshold, currently $10 million, all the clubs would share the cost, spread the risk across the entire system. This meant that if a tanker caused a $5 billion oil spill, no single club would be bankrupted. The cost would be distributed across all 13 clubs. And then above that, they had collective reinsurance, a massive policy purchased from the global reinsurance market, the largest private reinsurance contract on Earth. The system was incredibly stable, incredibly reliable, and because it covered 90% of global shipping, it became essential infrastructure. You couldn't operate in the legitimate global economy without it, and for over a century that was fine. The clubs provided insurance, ships traded, the system worked. But in 2022, Western governments realized they were sitting on a weapon, and they decided to use it. February 24th, 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. The West responds with sanctions, freezing Russian assets, banning imports, cutting off technology. But there's a problem. Russia is one of the world's largest oil exporters, roughly 10% of global oil production. If they ban Russian oil completely, prices explode. Inflation gets worse. Voters get angry. Politicians lose elections. So they need a different approach. They need to damage Russia's economy without destroying their own. And in December 2022, the G7, the European Union, and Australia announced a new policy, the oil price cap. The mechanism is simple but devastatingly effective. Western companies are prohibited from providing insurance, financing, or shipping services for Russian seaborne oil unless that oil is sold below a specific price cap, initially set at $60 per barrel. Think about how this works. A Russian oil company wants to sell oil to India. The oil is trading at $80 a barrel. Market price, good profit. They find a tanker to ship it. But if that tanker wants insurance from a Western P and I club, the club has to verify that the oil was sold at or below $60. If it was sold above the cap, the club has to refuse coverage. And without that coverage, the tanker technically cannot trade. It cannot pass through the Bosphorus Strait, cannot enter Rotterdam, cannot dock in Singapore. It becomes a pariah, locked out of the legitimate global shipping network. This is the weaponization of the P and I clubs. The directive forced insurers to become enforcers. They had to demand attestations, proof that the oil was sold at the legal price. If a tanker wanted to sell oil at market rates above the cap, the major insurers in London had to pull their coverage. But why couldn't Russia just insure the ships themselves? This is where the leverage of the reinsurance market comes in. A single major oil spill can cost $4 or $5 billion to clean up. Think about the Prestige disaster in 2002. 60,000 tons of heavy fuel oil spilled off the coast of Spain. Over 2,300 kilometers of coastline contaminated. The cleanup cost billions, and that was with proper insurance backing it up. Very few individual companies or even state funds have the liquidity to cover that risk instantly. They rely on the global reinsurance market to spread that risk, and that market is almost entirely dominated by Western capital. Lloyd's of London, Swiss Re, Munich Re, the big reinsurers who provide the backstop. Russia has domestic insurers, companies like Ingolstadt, but they're not playing in the same league. They don't have the capital reserves. They don't have access to the global reinsurance market. And most importantly, they can't transfer billions of dollars internationally because they're cut off from the Western banking system. The theory was sound. If you control the insurance, you control the flow of energy. No insurance, no revenue. No revenue, no war. The Invisible Blockade would force Russia to sell cheap or not sell at all. But, as with all forms of economic warfare, the enemy gets a vote. And Russia's response was to build a parallel maritime reality. Russia didn't just accept the blockade. They engineered a workaround. Starting in mid-2022, shipbrokers noticed something strange happening in the second-hand tanker market. Aging vessels. Ships that would normally be headed to scrapyards in Bangladesh to be torn apart for metal. Ships 20, 25, even 30 years old. Suddenly, they're being bought up, and not by reputable shipping companies, by anonymous shell companies, registered in Dubai, Hong Kong, the Seychelles, places where you can create a corporation with minimal paperwork and maximum opacity. Estimates suggest this shadow fleet now numbers between 600 and 1,200 vessels. Think about that scale. That's not a few ships sneaking around. That's a significant percentage of the global tanker fleet operating outside the Western financial system. And here's what makes it truly insidious. These aren't new ships. Russia spent approximately $10 billion according to the Kiev School of Economics, not building new tankers, buying old ones. Western shipping companies were happy to sell, especially Greek owners. According to a Brookings Institution analysis, almost 60% of sanctioned shadow fleet vessels were sold by Western European companies. Greek ship owners alone account for the largest share. So Western ship owners are selling their aging, barely seaworthy tankers to shell companies at inflated prices, making a nice profit. And those ships immediately drop their Western insurance, switch to Russian or questionable coverage, and start hauling oil above the price cap. The irony is almost perfect. The West creates sanctions to starve Russia of revenue, and Western companies profit by selling Russia the tools to evade those sanctions. But how do these ships operate? How do they move oil without legitimate insurance? How do they avoid being caught? The answer is a playbook straight out of a spy thriller. Tactic 1, going dark. These vessels switch off their automatic identification systems, AIS. Every commercial ship is supposed to broadcast its position constantly for safety and navigation. Shadow fleet vessels just turn it off. They disappear from tracking systems, or they do something even more sophisticated. They broadcast false positions. A satellite image shows the ship near Turkey, but the AIS signal says it's near Bulgaria, hundreds of miles away. Tactic 2, ship-to-ship transfers, STS. A Russian tanker meets a shadow fleet vessel in international waters, off the coast of Greece, mid-Atlantic, somewhere with no oversight. They transfer the oil at sea. Now the origin is obscured. The shadow vessel delivers the cargo to refineries in India or China, labeled as Malaysian blend or simply undisclosed origin. The paperwork is clean. The oil is Russian. Tactic 3, cycling through flags of convenience. A ship might be registered in Gabon one month, Palau the next, Cameroon after that, nations with lax maritime oversight. In 2023, Gabon more than doubled its ship registry. 98% of those tankers are classified as high risk with no identifiable owner. And the insurance? It's mostly fiction. Some vessels carry policies from Ingostrak or other Russian state-linked insurers. But those policies might not be worth the paper they're printed on. Transferring billions of dollars from a Russian insurer to clean up a spill in European waters? Good luck with that, when Russia is under comprehensive financial sanctions. Other vessels have completely fraudulent insurance certificates, expired policies, made-up companies. The result? The price cap became porous. The Invisible Blockade developed holes. Russia continued exporting millions of barrels per day, at prices above the cap, outside Western control, and the shadow fleet kept growing. But this workaround created a new vulnerability. Not for Russia, for everyone else. We are now watching hundreds of geriatric tankers navigating some of the world's most sensitive choke points. Every single day. Ships that are 15, 20, 25 years old, poorly maintained, operated by anonymous shell companies designed to be disposable. They pass through the Danish Straits, narrow waterways between Denmark and Sweden, critical route for Baltic trade. They sail through the English Channel, one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. They navigate the crowded waters of Southeast Asia, the Strait of Malacca, the South China Sea. And they're doing it without valid Tier 1 insurance. Think about the implications. If a shadow fleet tanker runs aground off the coast of Denmark, if it collides with a passenger ferry in the Baltic, if it breaks apart and spills 200,000 barrels of crude oil into the North Sea, who pays for the cleanup? The Western P&I clubs will deny coverage. The ship was violating sanctions, operating outside the system. The Russian insurers? They'll refuse to pay. Or they won't have the capital. Or they won't be able to transfer funds due to banking restrictions. The shell company that technically owns the ship? It'll dissolve overnight. Bankruptcy. Gone. We go back to the Pablo. After it exploded off Malaysia, the wreckage just sat there for weeks. There was no one to call, no one to sue. The cost of dealing with the hazard fell on the Malaysian government. Taxpayers. In a future scenario, it could be Denmark, the United Kingdom, Greece, France, any coastal state unlucky enough to have a shadow fleet disaster in their waters. This is the definition of privatized profit and socialized risk. The shadow fleet operators extract the value of the oil, collect their fees, make their money. And the environmental and economic risk is offloaded onto the rest of the world. Coastal communities, fishing industries, tourism, ecosystems. Everyone else pays. And the incidents are increasing. According to multiple reports, shadow fleet vessels are now experiencing accidents at a rate of approximately 2 per month. Groundings, collisions, engine failures, fires. In January 2024, an 18-year-old sanctioned tanker called the Paria had an anchor malfunction in the Bosphorus. It got stuck, blocked all traffic through one of the world's most critical shipping lanes for days, because nobody could figure out who owned it or who was responsible. This isn't a theoretical risk. This is a ticking time bomb floating on the high seas. Hundreds of barely seaworthy tankers, carrying millions of barrels of oil, operating with fraudulent or non-existent insurance, moving through some of the busiest, most environmentally sensitive waters on the planet. And the more the West weaponizes insurance, the bigger the shadow fleet grows. The more opaque it becomes, the more dangerous. But beyond the environmental risk, the existence of the shadow fleet signals something more profound, a structural shift in how global trade operates. For decades, the entire system functioned on a single unified operating system. Western finance, Western insurance, Western legal frameworks. You played by those rules or you didn't play at all. That system is fracturing. We're watching in real time the emergence of a bifurcated global economy. One sphere operates within the G7 rules: high compliance, high insurance standards, transparent ownership, clear accountability. The other sphere operates in the shadows, using a patchwork of parallel services, alternative insurers, ghost companies, flags of convenience, ships with fake documentation. And this isn't just about Russia. Iran has been using a shadow fleet for years to evade oil sanctions. Venezuela, North Korea, any country under Western sanctions is now learning from this playbook. Building parallel infrastructure, finding ways to operate outside Western control. The implications go far beyond oil. The P&I clubs ensure 90% of ocean-going tonnage. That's not just oil tankers. That's container ships carrying consumer goods, bulk carriers transporting grain, everything. If the shadow economy spreads beyond sanctioned oil to general cargo, we're looking at a fundamental breakdown in global trade architecture. And here's the uncomfortable question nobody wants to ask. What happens when China decides it doesn't want to rely on Western insurance? When they build their own P&I clubs, their own reinsurance market, their own completely parallel system? They have the capital, they have the scale, and they're watching very carefully how Russia is being cut off from Western financial infrastructure. The Belt and Road Initiative isn't just about building ports and roads. It's about creating alternative trade routes, alternative financing, alternative insurance, a world where you don't need London or New York to approve your transactions. The more the West weaponizes every piece of financial infrastructure, the faster other countries build alternatives. And once those alternatives exist, once they're established and functional, countries have a choice. They can operate in the Western system with all its rules and oversight, or they can operate in the parallel system with more freedom and less accountability. But here's the part that should terrify policymakers. The shadow fleet isn't just a Russian problem anymore. It's becoming a business model, a template. And legitimate shipping companies are starting to pay attention. Because think about it from a ship owner's perspective. You have an old tanker, 20 years old, expensive to maintain, doesn't meet the latest environmental standards. In the legitimate market, it's worth maybe $20 million, headed for the scrapyard soon. But if you sell it to a shell company that'll use it in the shadow fleet, suddenly it's worth 30, 40, maybe 50 million, because it has value as a sanctions evasion tool, as a ghost ship that can operate outside the rules. The financial incentive is overwhelming, and we're seeing it happen. Western shipping companies, including some of the most respected names in the industry, have sold vessels that ended up in the shadow fleet. They claim they didn't know. They sold to legitimate buyers who then resold to questionable entities. But the pattern is clear. This creates a grotesque feedback loop. Sanctions create demand for shadow vessels. That demand drives up prices for old tankers. Western ship owners profit from selling their aging fleet. Those ships then help sanctioned countries evade the very sanctions that created the demand in the first place. And there's another twist. The shadow fleet is creating a safety crisis that affects everyone. These poorly maintained vessels with questionable insurance don't just risk environmental disasters, they risk collisions with legitimate ships. If a shadow fleet tanker, running dark, crashes into a container ship in the Mediterranean, who's liable? The container ship had proper insurance, but the tanker didn't. The container ship's insurer has to pay. That's not fair. But that's what happens when you have ghost ships operating outside the system. The international group is now facing claims from legitimate vessels that have been damaged by Shadow Fleet ships, and they're realizing that the weaponization of insurance has created unintended consequences. They're not just excluding sanctioned vessels, they're creating a parallel maritime system that threatens everyone's safety. In November 2025, Ukraine started conducting drone strikes on Shadow Fleet tankers, attacking them directly. 2 vessels hit off the Turkish coast, the Virat and the Kairos. This isn't economic warfare anymore. This is actual warfare. Ships are being blown up. And it's happening because insurance, of all things, became a weapon. The Invisible Blockade forced the conflict into the shadows. And in the shadows, the rules break down, safety standards disappear, accountability evaporates, and the risk gets distributed to everyone. The maritime insurance industry was designed to facilitate trade, to make global commerce possible, to spread risk so that no single entity would be bankrupted by a disaster. It was meant to be neutral, technical, boring, the paperwork that keeps ships moving. But in the 21st century, every connection is a vulnerability, every dependency is a weapon. Every piece of infrastructure can be weaponized. The Shadow Fleet proves that you can ban a ship from your ports, but you can't easily ban it from the ocean. The Invisible Blockade has forced the conflict into the shadows, creating a lawless layer of global commerce that threatens the environmental and economic security of everyone. Coastal states, fishing communities, legitimate shipping companies, all of us. Because this isn't just about oil. This is about how power operates in an interconnected world, how dependencies create leverage, how the strategic control over critical supply chains can reshape the global order without firing a shot. The P&I clubs ensure 90% of global shipping. That concentration of power made them efficient, made them stable, and made them an irresistible target for weaponization. Now we're living with the consequences: a growing fleet of ghost ships, unclear ownership, fraudulent insurance, rising accident rates, environmental time bombs floating through critical waterways, and the fundamental question nobody has answered: what happens when the next major spill occurs? When a 25-year-old Shadow Fleet tanker breaks apart off the coast of France? When there's no insurance to pay for it? When the shell company vanishes? When the Russian insurer refuses to engage? The cost will fall on taxpayers, on local communities, on everyone except the people who profited from the system. Privatized profit, socialized risk, the oldest trick in the book, now applied to global maritime trade. The invisible weapon has been deployed, the blockade is in place, but the blockade is leaking. And the leaks are more dangerous than the blockade itself, because in trying to control the flow of oil with insurance paperwork, Western governments have created something worse: a parallel maritime system, operating outside the rules, outside accountability, outside safety standards, ships that nobody owns, insurance that doesn't pay, accidents that nobody claims, and the ocean, vast and indifferent, hosting an expanding fleet of ghosts. Until one of them breaks. Until the oil spills. Until the catastrophe that everyone saw coming finally arrives. And when it does, we'll all remember that this didn't happen because of war. It happened because of insurance. The most boring, bureaucratic, invisible weapon ever deployed, and the most dangerous. If this analysis showed you a side of geopolitical conflict you've never seen before, hit the like button and share the video. If you want to understand how financial architecture shapes global power, subscribe. Because the next video is going to show you another hidden mechanism, another invisible weapon, another way that money and paperwork determine who wins wars before the first shot is ever fired. And remember, in modern warfare, the most dangerous weapons are the ones you can't see. The ones written in insurance contracts and reinsurance agreements. The ones that don't explode. They just make other people's explosions your problem. Click the next video for another deep exposition. Thanks for watching.